Let us move to our webinar. Today, we are having the third webinar in the series of meetings together with the company of Procurement Central from the UK. And also we have kind of a format of the West meets the East, or the East meets the West. We are exchanging and sharing the opinions and experience. We are taking the best practices and giving the best practices, whatever we can do. So today we have the topic of the relations between the suppliers or contracts. We will speak about the relations and about the tools, and especially for that, we have invited today rather esteemed and professional speakers who will share today their knowledge, their expertise and developments. That is Victoria Sebko from Ukraine. Victoria will tell about herself later, and Peter Sammons from the UK. Peter also has huge experience and lots of developments. He's written the book, and I do hope Peter will tell about that as well. So a couple of words about the organizers. I will tell first about our company and give the floor to Stephen, who is the co-founder and owner of the company of Procurement Central. I'm the representative of the company of IPSM. We are the co-organizers of these webinars. The company of IPSM is dealing with consulting and training in the procurement and supply chain. We are providing different services, beginning with the assessment and the audit of the purchase and supply chain, and ending with the full implementation of the changes and also outsourcing of the procurement services. We have this year some of the open trainings which we offer for your consideration. We have certain services which you can get acquainted with at the website. All of that will be written in the chat by my colleagues, and you will get to know about that. If you're interested, we'll definitely answer any of your questions. I'm giving the floor now to Stephen for him to tell about himself and about his company.
Thank you very much, Marina. I am Steve Wills, as Marina said, of Procurement Central, located in the UK. And I want to just share with you a little bit about the topic that we have today, because I'm very fortunate to have with me some colleagues from Procurement Central, which is Peter Sammons, who you've just heard about, and in a moment, Debbie Sorrell, who will introduce herself and then pass over to Peter. I just want to tell you a little bit about my view on supplier relationship management, and I hope to position today's roundtable discussion. What do I think supplier relationship management is all about? Well, let me tell you what I don't think it is. It's not some one size or one approach that you can use for everything. It's not about being friends with people, although we can certainly be sociable. And it's not about being soft and easy with people. So let me tell you what I think it is. It is about putting a lot of effort into planning, preparation, and execution. And it is about what I would call a tensioned relationship with a framework and a foundation. And it's this framework and foundation that I just want to talk with you about for a moment, because it sets up what Peter and Victoria will be talking about in their presentations. The foundation of supplier relationship management is at its heart an agreement, including a contract, a service level agreement, and KPIs, key performance indicators. This specifies and outlines the key responsibilities of each party in the relationship. At the heart of that are the five rights of procurement. So let's just remind ourselves what they are. Firstly, it's the supplier and what they're providing. Then it's what we're being charged. Then it's making sure that it comes to the right location with the right quality and the right quantity. These are some of the fundamentals that will go into the contract that will formulate the relationship. The contract is essential. It gives everyone clarity on what commitment has been undertaken on both sides. The other thing that's worth mentioning, because these are elements that IPSM and Procurement Central deliver in our courses and our consultancy. And we talk a lot about the 5 rights, and we talk a lot about Crowdcheck. So let's look quickly at Crowdcheck to determine the particular relationships that are best for our business. There's partnership and collaboration, which of course you can't just jump into. You must find the right criteria and select the right partner to do that. There's something called the bottleneck, meaning a supplier that probably has a monopoly and there aren't very many of them that you can switch from one supplier to another. There's where you go with your volumes, a leveraged relationship, and possibly a relationship that you might, we say, have a soft touch on, which is the non-critical relationship. You don't probably invest as much time in that. This helps us, having the Crowdcheck framework, to determine how much time and skill we need to invest to make the relationship work. But just be careful, a note of caution. Don't get deceived by the supplier. Be very careful that the supplier sees the relationship the same way you do, or they will end up exploiting your naivety in sharing information and being open. You'll be considering collaboration perhaps when the supplier sees it as something like a consumable item. So my end of message here is you've got to get the relationship right from the start and all the moving parts that will come up in place to make this a success. So welcome to today. It's always our pleasure to introduce you to these roundtable discussions. I'm going to hand you over now to our expert, Debbie Sorrell, and she in turn will hand over and introduce our first speaker. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, very good introduction by Steve to what SRM is. I would just like to add to that, if I can, that there are various sort of definitions of SRM, and you will find that there isn't just one single definition of what it means. So it means different things to different people. And if you look at what, for example, a software vendor that is maybe selling you a system to run your supplier relationships and contracts on, they will have a very different definition of what SRM is about, and that will be based on things like managing the transactions and interrelationship between organizations. That will be different to somebody else's definition, which might be much more focused around the actual relationship and relationship management skills. So it sort of means different things to different people. But I think for me, just to pull out that it does really depend on not just what you do, but how you do it. So those relationship skills are very key. Having those interpersonal skills, being able to develop the right skills to do what Steve said, which is drive relationships and manage them without it being too close and too, as we call it in the UK, cozy. We don't want it to look like something untoward, but we need to be professional. So I think it's really important that you have the right people involved in supplier relationship management with those interpersonal skills as well as the technical knowledge. And I think, you know, referring back to Crowdcheck again, as Steve did, if we're dealing with suppliers that are in the strategic segment of Crowdcheck, then we're trying to, what Crowdcheck tells us is drive relationship. We need to drive relationship and maximize the benefits from that. So we're looking at things like delivering innovation, you know, jointly working in terms of business planning and business approach. sort of one team as we look to address issues. We're looking at one team to solve issues rather than two. So we need to make sure that we can employ those skills to do that. And then I also think, in terms of the critical bottleneck segment, we're looking to secure supply. This is something that's really important to us these days with the global supply chain management sort of demands, really, of doing things in the current climate. COVID has sort of taught us a lot about how we need to improve security of supply when we're sourcing globally. We need to have contingency plans. And to do that successfully, I would say that what we need to have is very good relationship management skills and very good relationships with our key suppliers to be able to have contingencies in place and look at how we secure supply. And the very last thing I would point out is for big organisations that are running a lot of projects or a lot of contracts that are using the same supplier, it is really important to have that horizontal view. So somebody managing the relationship across all of those individual projects so that we can make sure that we're consistent, we know what's happening, we're not having one contract where a supplier is performing well and another one where they're performing badly and we don't know about it. So it is really important to have the structure, the organisational structure in place that allows that to work and allows that sort of holistic view across the whole organisation to work. Okay, so that's my view, very, very strong on the relationship skills. And at that point, I'd just like to hand over to Peter. Peter, if you could take it from there, that would be lovely. Thank you. Peter, you're on mute.
Yeah, Peter.
You're on mute, Peter.
Unmute. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
yes,
that's fine.
We can now.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Debbie. Yeah, Debbie has just reminded us of something which I think is really very, very important. Over the last 12 months, the whole COVID situation, the one message that we seem to be getting in the supply chain world is that those businesses that had strong supplier relationships, something more than just the contract, are the ones that have really thrived and survived and benefited in the current situation. So that's an important thing. Debbie also mentioned the fact that there are so many different definitions of what SRM is. I think over here in Europe, we're quite strong on this. I think we're quite mature on this. Certainly the software manufacturers, suppliers, and particularly the American ones, when they talk about SRM, all they really mean is contract management, the mechanical parts of it. So their understanding of SRM, I think, is quite different to what we understand by that. The other thing is I did work for a fair time with a company called Railtrack. It's part of the rail infrastructure. They had a lot of contracts when I was working with them under a process called alliancing. That was the term that they used then. They thought of it in terms of supplier relationship management, but undoubtedly, and I don't think I'm saying anything secret here, the big suppliers thought of it as the suppliers run the show and Railtrack pays the bills. So it was a form of relationship that actually did not work very well for the customer. And something similar perhaps has happened over here in terms of public-private partnership, where it sometimes seems that the government maybe is a little bit naive and the relationship tends to be driven by the supplier. So what about myself? Yes, my background is in procurement. My particular interest is contracts, contract law, and contract management. And so I've written a book called Contract Management, Core Business Competence. And it's really those last three words, core business competence, so that all organizations are involved in contracting, but relatively few actually train their people in how to manage a contract. So I think one of the things that we do at Procurement Central is to focus on the right sort of training to give people the right sort of skills, some of which are hard skills, some of which are soft skills. Okay, so that's really my introduction. Would you like me to carry on with the presentation part?
Yep, please.
Can I share the screen?
Yes, please.
Okay, can you tell me what you're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, we've got it. Thank you.
You've got it. That's good. Okay, well, contract management then and SRM, Supplier Relationship Management. I think we're probably all reasonably comfortable with the broad principles of this, that supplier relationship management is about something bigger than just the contract. So I think what we're going to consider now is how contract management itself and how the contract sets the tone of the relationship between the two parties, and how contract management acts as a bridge between our SRM objectives and the practical day-to-day outcomes. Or we can say this, that we can talk, for hours and hours about relationships, but that at the end of the day, we still have to manage the contracts. My background then, very briefly, as I say, all of my career really in the procurement field. I started off in aviation. I then worked in electricity generation, so National Power PLC. It's now owned by a German group. Then I moved into financial services, where I met Steve and worked in his team with AXA, and later on Credit Suisse, which is the global investment banking group, which at that time, like AXA, actually at the same time, were both doing SRM and developing SRM approaches. So there's an illustration there of the cover of my book. So that's my background. The contract. The contract then is the foundation of all commercial relationships. I once had a conversation with a lawyer, and I said to the lawyer, what is it that keeps you awake at night? What is it that you worry about in terms of contracts? And he said, there are 7 things, Peter, 7 things that worry me as a lawyer and worry all lawyers. Now, lawyers don't necessarily think the same way that we do as procurement people. And he said, jurisdiction, number 1, the law of the contract. Number 2, due diligence on the contracting parties. Who am I actually getting into contract with? Now, we don't worry too much about that in procurement because generally speaking, we think that we know, but for a lawyer, this is absolutely foundational. The third item was termination. Having got into the contract as a lawyer, can I get my client out of the contract? The fourth was indemnification. If something goes wrong, who pays the bill? The fifth element was payment. How will that happen? The sixth element was intellectual property. We now live in very much in an intellectual property-driven world, a data-driven world. So they worry about that. And finally, warranties. That's all of the other things in a contract, the promises that are made between the parties. From a procurement viewpoint, I think our world is slightly different. We probably look at, I'll just briefly mention the headings, transfer of ownership. If I'm paying the bills as a buyer, at what point do I actually get ownership of the goods or ownership of the service? So transfer of ownership, then payment. When do I part with my money? And do I get value for my money? IPRs, intellectual property rights. We're concerned about those things. Time. Will the contract be performed in accordance with our time constraints? Breach. If things go wrong, how do we put them right? And what are my rights and powers under the contract? And then finally, formal amendments under the contract, because under any contract, the chances are we may have to change it. So a contract under English law, I'm sure this may be the same in Ukraine, can be formed in a number of different ways. As business people, we just need to understand how we form our contract and what is incorporated into the contract. But the point being, however the contract is formed, we still have to manage it in accordance with the parties' intentions. Right, so now we come to the idea of what are the things that we have to do and how do we invest our time on a day-to-day basis? I'm going to suggest to you that the proper balance is something like this, 80-20. 20% of it, yes, it's based upon a legal agreement between the parties, and if the agreement goes wrong, the law may have to step in. But 80% of our time, I think, should be spent on the practical day-to-day running of the contract. So I think in relationship management, we cannot lose sight of the idea that we still have to manage the contract itself and its objectives. So 80% of our task then is all of this day-to-day stuff around things like payment, communications, correspondence, change management, actually changing the contract after it's underway. And in addition to all of that, the relationship, the business relationship between the parties. So then the next question really becomes, well, what skills do we need to do all of these things properly? I'm going to suggest that there are probably 4 basic skill areas that we need. And I'm sure that you will recognize these from the Ukraine situation as well. The first is really project management type skills for a contract manager, very important. And I think that's a good proxy of what contract management is about. It's about managing projects, making things happen, making them happen in accordance with the agreement, or the critical path, to use that term from a project management point of view. So our contract needs to hit the critical path. The second thing to say is we need appropriate technical competence. Now, in my past, I've worked with a lot of engineering firms. I am not an engineer, but I at least have some comprehension, some understanding of what the engineering task is. But I know as a contracts specialist, if I need a specialist engineer to back me up and help me, I ask for that support. Steve has heard me say this many times in past courses that we delivered, but I have one contract, all of us have one contract in our life that went very badly wrong. So mine is called the combustion test facility, and I still have nightmares about it. But it was the one contract that went terribly, terribly wrong. We didn't quite get to law, but it looked like we were going to head into a legal dispute. But what went wrong with that contract were the first 2 things were wrong. The project management skills, we didn't really understand how complicated the whole project was going to be, and our technical competence at an engineering level was not where we thought it was. And on the basis of that, the whole contract was founded on a false premise, a false understanding. The third skill set area is contract law and the contract terms. If I'm a contract manager, you expect me to know all of the ins and outs of the contract quite correctly. And the last skill area is really a bit of a hybrid. Last year in Britain, 340 CPOs, Chief Procurement Officers, were asked their opinion of what the top 10 contract management skills are. And it's an interesting list. I won't go through all of them because I don't think we've got time. But number 1 was understanding the contract terms and conditions. Number 2 was negotiation skills. Number 3 was soft skills, such as influencing. And right down at number 10 was relationship management. Now, I was quite surprised when I saw that. I'm not sure I agree with that list. I think I wouldn't have answered the question in quite the same way. But 340 UK CPOs listed it in this basis. I think I would have put relationship management, certainly in the top 5, maybe in the top 4. Risk management is at position number 4. Handling conflicts and dispute resolution was at number 6. Well, maybe I would have perhaps put that possibly slightly higher. But there we are. So there's different views on the way that we, the sort of skills that we need. Now, I would say very briefly, there are probably 4 dynamics to this whole question of contract management, and we need to be aware of them. The first point is, who are you as a contract manager? You know, do you know what your personality profile is? Do you know what your strengths are? Do you know what your weaknesses are? Some people talk in terms of personality profiling. We've probably all heard of, you know, the red, blue, green, and yellow personality profiles. Other people talk in terms of, but it's equivalent, warm, tough, numbers, dealer. What sort of person are you? Because the sort of person that you are is going to influence the way that you manage the contract. You might also recognize those traits in, you know, the supplier company as well. What sort of sales manager are you dealing with? The second is, frankly, what does the contract say? We need to be, you know, 100% sure that we're really comfortable with what the contract itself is about. The third area is project management, and I've already mentioned that. We need those sorts of skills that we can manage things on a day-to-day basis. And finally, and this is perhaps much more towards SRM, there's the idea of interpersonal relationships. So we're all people. It is people that form relationships, not companies. So as Steve said in his opening remarks, you know, we need to be aware of this and we need to be consciously building relationships. So who are you and who are they? I think is the key question. But without losing sight of the idea that we can simplify the contract part of the relationship into these 2 things at the top, all of the things that I must do and all of the things that they must do. And really, the 4 key elements of that are suggested here. Communication, well, that's a 2-way process between the 2 parties, and we need to keep communication going, especially in a good and well-balanced relationship. Payment, well, usually that's from the buyer to the supplier. So that's a 1-way street, usually. Change management. The contract, if it's complicated, if it's strategic, if it's big, it will probably change during its course. Usually that's from the buyer to the seller, but it could be a 2-way process. And finally, resolving problems. Again, that should be a 2-way process, and certainly within SRM, it should be a 2-way process. Now, the next question becomes, what sort of contract do we have? What sort of contract does your company have? Is it a 19th century contract, an old-fashioned contract? Or is it a 21st century contract? I'm just going to suggest in the red writing in front of you, a 19th century contract or an old-fashioned contract, maybe a lawyer-driven contract, is likely to have these things. It's likely to be combative, adversarial. It tends to pitch the 2 parties against each other rather than encouraging them to work together. It's very much focused on indemnities. If things go wrong, who pays for them? It puts in various loopholes so that if things go wrong, I find a loophole that will protect me and maybe punish the other party. And therefore it sets traps for the unwary. Sometimes these contracts can be so deliberately written that they can actually represent almost sharp business practice, sharp practice between the parties. And they're very complicated, full of legal language, legalese, as we say, which do not help the parties to work together in a sort of partnership style. A modern contract, a 21st century contract on the left, much more like this, encouraging the parties to work together in a trustworthy, on a trustworthy basis, balanced between the parties. Interlocking, if you've got multiple contracts under a project, that all the contracts work the same sort of way. Early warning systems built into the contract document itself. Fair dealing between the parties with a problem-solving mindset. And the contract itself sees itself as being a tool of project management, not a pair of boxing gloves to go and hit the other party with. So it tends to drive the right sorts of behavior. Now, in saying all of those things, you're probably now thinking, is there such a thing as a perfect contract? Well, maybe. Over here in the UK, we have a contract. It actually originated in South Africa, but it's called the NEC, used to be the New Engineering Contract, NEC 4. It's a system of contracts, about 23 different model contracts, but they all operate in the same sort of way. But the NEC has been designed really to help projects work well and to help the parties to work together in a collaborative style. So that's the beauty of the NEC. It takes a bit of getting used to, but once you are used to it, it's like riding a bike. You know, once you've learned how to ride, you know how to use the NEC 4 contract. I may say a little bit more about that if there are any specific questions, but I might just suggest to you that if ever you're looking for a new model form of contract, the NEC might be one to have a look at because it does represent good, modern, 21st century practice, and it is very much a tool of project management. Okay, I think that we're all familiar with Crowdcheck. Steve mentioned Crowdcheck earlier. Gives us this idea of supplier positioning on the left-hand side here, the 4 boxes. Risk from low to high, relative cost from low to high. So if whatever we're buying is high risk, high cost, it's a strategic, critical item. So where do we focus our attention as we're building relationships? We're back to that 80-20 rule, I think. I would suggest that probably we're going to build relationships, strong relationships, with that 80% in the top right-hand side, the strategic, critical suppliers and contractors who represent most risk and who represent most opportunity to our organization. And probably 90% in that top strategic area. But never forget that low-risk contracts or apparently low-risk contracts are not necessarily low risk. Very brief story. I once worked with an international bank. We had a marketing department that placed a purchase order for some marketing goods, which happened to be hold-alls, you know, bags with the bank's logo stamped on the side. The contract value was about £5,000. And then we found out that the hold-all came from, I think it was either India or China. The bags have been built with, using child labor. All of a sudden, we have enormously bad PR, public relations. Tiny contract that could have lost this bank millions of pounds worth of business in bad publicity. So small contracts are not necessarily not strategic risk. So we just have to be alive and alert to the problems that contracts can present to us. Okay, so relationship management then. What are we aiming for? I'm going to suggest this. 3 very simple points. Probably we want to have a win-win relationship, that both we and the supplier are achieving things that are of long-term value to us. We're procurement people, so we know that sometimes a win-lose relationship is okay, where we win and the supplier loses. But generally, and particularly for big contracts, strategic contracts, a win-win is what we're looking for. And therefore, we want to, second point, drive good behaviors, both in ourselves and in the supplying partner. And thirdly, we need to do something around team building to make sure that our teams actually work together and know how to work together. Steve and I in the past have seen some contracts where we've actually spent a little bit of money to actually get the seller's team and the buyer's team together on team building days, just so that they know each other, we eyeball each other, we know each other personal colleagues, and we begin to form as a team. So team building skills are important. And the last thing I want to say is that today we live in a digital world, and everybody is talking about the value of computer-based systems and the fact that our systems are generating more and more data. So our world is increasingly based upon the digital environment in which we work. My question to you is, how good is your contract system, your contract management system, and does it generate the data that you need in order to manage the relationship effectively? Does it provide all of the waypoints, the reference points during the relationship that help you to ensure that the relationship is going where it should be? Our modern world is very much focused now on issues of quality and issues of sustainability. Sustainability is the big word at the moment. Well, increasingly, we're going to be required to provide data that proves that we're doing things in a sustainable way. So our systems need to support us on that. Finally, blockchain. Yeah, a lot of hype around blockchain. Blockchain isn't really going to change the way relationships work, but it is going to provide us with additional data that may be very valuable and helpful to us. Okay, so that's really where I wanted to leave it today. As I say, contract management itself has to be a core business competence for all commercial people, whether you're selling or whether you're buying. If I have learned one thing in terms of contract management above everything else, it is to remember that I'm always in a potential negotiating situation, especially when I'm in contracts. Therefore, if I'm talking about changing the contract, changing the objectives of the contract, I always use the technical legal term without prejudice and subject to contract. You know, so we need to do our discussions, our negotiations with our eyes wide open to what the legal realities are. That doesn't disturb the relationship, but it just means to say that we all recognize at the end of the day, the contract itself has to catch up with what the relationship is trying to achieve. Okay, that's all I wanted to say on relationship management at this point.
Thank you, Peter. That was excellent. I know the questions are coming in, so I'm going to hand over to Marina in a second. I just wanted to say that I thought that that was exactly what I was hoping it would be ahead of Victoria's presentation, because you've brought through with some good examples as well, which really bring it to life, but focusing around NEC4, the new model contract, you've really explained that a relationship in business, a relationship with a supplier, how it's much more than related and tied to the contract. And that makes it very, very different to, shall we say, a relationship that we're building socially. So I think that that really came alive through your presentation. Marina, I see that we have a question, so maybe I could hand over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. Would you please stop sharing the screen, if you don't mind? Oh, yes, thank you so much. Okay, so before I read the question, I would like to say, Peter, thank you so much for the presentation. I personally really liked the emphasis which you posed all over the presentation. I will tell out of my own experience. I am teaching CIPS in Ukraine, and one of the modules which are included in the diploma program is the contract management. So all of the students always remark how, first of all, complicated this module is, and secondly, how important it is, and how many things can be can be done by even experienced CPOs, and they sometimes can fail because they forget about some of the simple things. For instance, it may seem that it's so simple. What is contract management? Just to prepare it, to deal with the lawyer, then to sign it, to award it, and then to look at the conditions with the supplier. But in fact, if you have a different approach, which is not just to make it, to tick all the boxes, but to make it a tool which can help you in the relationship management with the suppliers to achieve the aims which you appointed, then the contract itself and the relationship with the suppliers within this contract will lead to lots of value. So thank you so much that you said comparing old school, retro approach, old-fashioned approach, and the modern approach, contemporary one, where you need to emphasize in a different way, and that you totally spoke about the win-win situation. It is so important. And this is the foundation for the future relationship, especially you made this relationship more relevant during the last year and this year. I totally agree with you. And thank you so much that you mentioned about that. So in fact, then we have the question which is in the mood of what you told. The company of Kernel, Ukraine, is interested in the following. So, hello, Peter, would you please tell what is the practice of the resolving of conflicts when, for instance, the delivery term is not proper, if the contract has foreseen some of the penal sanctions? Do we need to get to the court, or there are some alternative solutions? Out of your experience, which cases did you have? Which cases did you have when you had to solve this issue? And you can name these success cases from the British business and from the international business, because as far as I know, Kernel company has lots of international contracts. They acquire experience, equipment all over the world, some of the expensive solutions, so it's very relevant for them.
Okay, thank you. A very good question. In terms of contract requirements being missed, I mean, time delay has to be certainly one of the top 5 areas where contracts are going to go wrong. So time delay is something that we have to focus upon and keep monitoring all the time. That again is where our contract system may be able to help us. That is again where our project management skills should be able to help us. But it's a bit like the cowboy, isn't it? The cowboy, does he reach for his gun first of all? You know, in all the old cowboy films, that's the solution to the problem. Do we reach for the lawyer and say, lawyer, come and sort this out? Because lawyers, bless them, can have a habit of making things get worse rather than better. So I would say this, that if we are monitoring our contract adequately, and we are beginning to detect that things are going wrong and that therefore there will be a delay, usually under the terms of the contract, we should be issuing a formal instruction, or to use the technical term, notice, to the other party to say there is a problem emerging. I require you, contractor, to solve the problem and to confirm to me that you are solving the problem. And usually the notice will say, I demand a response within a certain period of time. Now, sometimes we feel a little bit edgy about issuing notices under a contract because it starts to look combative. We're now getting into a fight rather than that idea that we have a friendly relationship. So I think from my background experience, I may talk again about my contract that went so badly wrong, but my background experience, I think, would be this. I would pick up the telephone, first of all, and say to my opposite number, look, we seem to have a problem here. This could be bad. Therefore, I need to meet with you, or we need to resolve this problem. So at first, I try to leverage the relationship to make sure the other party is switched on to the problem. Actually, they may just have missed it. And therefore, if we warn them, they may then respond in the right sort of way. But if I'm not getting the responses that I need, then probably my next conversation is, look, I'm feeling uncomfortable. I may have to issue a notice under the contract. I'd like to avoid that, but if I don't get an adequate response quickly, I'm going to have to do that. Why? Because my boss is telling me to. My Steve Wills here is telling me to do this, so I will have to do it. Then that again should focus their attention. But if it fails at that point, then probably, yes, we should be issuing that formal notice under the contract. With whatever regret we may have, we should be doing that so that we got the marker under the terms of the contract. If we fail to do what the contract says, we may fall into a trap later on. So being kind to a supplier is not always a good thing if it means that you're actually breaking the strict terms of the contract yourself. I did say I might talk again about my contract that went badly wrong, but it started off on the wrong foot. And the point was none of us understood how complicated the whole thing was to mobilize. And that's just something that I would learn. One of the questions that I learned from that I will always ask these days is to the contractor, how will you mobilize this contract if I award it to you? And I get a mobilization plan from the contractor. I didn't have that with this contract that went wrong. I always ask for it now.
Thank you, Peter. Debbie, can I just ask you?
Peter, спасибо большое. Можно,
Peter, thank you so much. Stephen, could I clarify, please, about this question first? Could you please tell, as for mobilization plan, do you claim it at the stage of the discussion of the contract before you sign it? And do you include it into the terms of the contract, right? Should it be documented?
That's a very good question. And I talk about it in my book. So that's part of the answer. But seriously, I don't think it should be a part of the contract, but I do think you should ask for the plan ahead of time. So you can incorporate the mobilization plan into the contract, but it's this old question of how much do you put into the contract? And the more that you put into the contract and the more documents that you put into the contract, there is a danger of conflict between the documents. And so I would say, as part of the tendering process, one of the tender responses, especially when you're into negotiations, I would say, I need to see your mobilization plan. I need to know, day by day, essentially what you're going to do to mobilize this contract. I will look at that, I will evaluate that, and I may have a discussion with them. So I will refer to it, but it will not necessarily be a part of the contract. But if it is a part of the contract, then you have something called a conditions precedence clause, so that there will be a hierarchy within the contract that says the contract terms are at the top, the specification is in the middle, and things like the contract mobilization plan is at the bottom. So at least you've got the hierarchy. That's the technical answer to the question.
Or Peter, could you have?
Да, спасибо, Peter.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Peter, could you have something where you put in a mobilization plan maybe into a schedule or an appendix, and you had some kind of flexibility for it to be reviewed and agreed by both parties, so that, if things were to change and both parties agreed that was okay, they could do that? Would that also work?
Yes, Debbie, I think it would. As I say, I personally feel a little bit uncomfortable about putting it into the contract, but you certainly can. Maybe there's an argument for saying it stands aside of the contract, almost like an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding. But if they fail to keep to the MOU, then immediately you can involve your seniors, your company seniors, and say, look, it looks like things are not going well. And it's, again, it's part of the relationship, isn't it? As you're building the relationship, you can say to the other party, look, we already seem to be failing at the initial stage. We need to address this problem.
Thank you.
Стивен, вы что-то хотели сказать?
Stephen, you wanted to add anything?
No, I think that's all very comprehensive. So over to you, Marina, to continue. And thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you so much. And now I'm coming to the second part, the second speaker of today. I'd like again to emphasize that when we prepared with Stephen for this webinar and discussed the issues which are debatable, we would like to drive your attention to the fact that creation of the relationship with the suppliers, well, unfortunately, we have such a stereotype, Peter said that it is having some beer or lunches. That is totally different thing, in fact. I would like to drive your attention that this is the set of tools. And the more we move along the creation of these relationships, the more we have to pay attention to the toolkit. Well, of course, it does not exclude that you can have some lunches together or have some beer, but still, first of all, you need some rules and norms according to which you are working and the relations which you will document in the papers, including the contract. And now Victoria will tell you about her own experience. And we have discussed with Victoria her report. It's so important for you to understand that with different suppliers, we need to create different relations. This is the key part of all of the actions which you will do. It will be reflected on the time which you pay to these or those suppliers, on the strategy which you create with them and the events which you conduct. It will also have impact onto the contract, whether this is the plain, simple contract or a hard one, a complicated one where you need to take into account lots of things. And maybe it will reflect on the actions which you will have to do day by day with your suppliers for the sake of the unified goal, for you to get the maximum effect on your relations with these suppliers, for them to bring as much value as possible, and for you to achieve the indicators which you are obliged to achieve for the business, the effect. So Victoria has nice cases how, with the help of rather simple tools, you can constantly monitor and constantly provide feedback to the suppliers. And Victoria, I'm giving the floor to you. Please, would you share this experience with us? Okay, good day. Esteemed colleagues, would you please tell, do you see the screen? Yes, we do see and hear you perfect. So the assessment of the suppliers. Victoria, could you say a couple of words about yourselves? Because I haven't done that. Okay. Well, I can see that lots of the participants of our today's webinar, in fact, are my colleagues, or at least ex-colleagues and present colleagues. So, in fact, lots of you know me already. I'm working in the procurement since 2005, and my experience of the main work is in the two bigger companies of Ukraine, the energy company, and now I'm working in the agrarian company, which is Ukrainian as well. That's an export-driven company. So maybe I will add something about myself more when I tell about my own expertise of implementation of supply assessment. The tool is rather simple, at least it seems to be, but I personally had, in fact, some complications to implement this tool and to make it functioning and working. I had 3 attempts, and only with the 3rd attempt, I managed to achieve a result with my colleagues. And now I may say that it's really a tool which is working, which is really influencing the processes, and that it's really creating value added. So why does the assessment of suppliers, why do we speak about the assessment of suppliers in the context of supply management. There are lots of quotes and phrases about that. One of them is, what's impossible to be measured, it's impossible to be managed. This was said by the Director General of General Electric, Jack Welch. He's written that in his book. So we can see lots of quotes, and Peter and Debbie and Steve have mentioned about the relationship with the suppliers. So the assessment task is to make these relations as objective as possible, as tangible as possible, I would even say. For them not to be some abstract thing. For them, for this relationship, cooperation with the suppliers to be based not on intuition, not on emotions, which can mostly be done and sometimes can be overwhelming, but at objective things as much as possible. Because thanks to the objectivity and the tools which are objective, we can manage the direction of the moves. We can appoint the aims and goals. We can show the suppliers what's important for us now and push our counter agents for them to move in the direction which is important for us as the customers. As I already mentioned, there were several attempts for me to try to implement this tool and to make it efficient. And being prepared to this webinar, I analyzed both the positive current experience and the negative one. And now I'd like to emphasize on the following issues. Which mistakes were done when we implement the assessment system? It's easy, it's simple, but it's not working. Not always, at least. So what do we need to do for the assessment to work? Which factors, and we will discuss them today, can be done, and you will understand whether your company is ready to implement the system of assessment, and this implementation will be efficient and successful, or maybe you lack anything still for such a successful implementation. Then, which stages of assessment can be automated? Today, it was mentioned by esteemed speakers that now digitalization and automation is topic number one. In our work of a Kernel company, it is the same, because our main internal partners, our developers, with whom we cooperate all the time, with whom we develop all the business requirements, and they rapidly respond, they implement the additional developments to our P2P system, procure to pay automated system of budget and procurement management. So, during my further speech, let us discuss what can be automated. And again, everything depends on the need of the business, the need of the client, and how can we motivate the customer to assess the awarded deals. I will tell, maybe there was the way of the full automation of the assessment. It can be partial, it can be totally manual. So we will discuss what it depends on. And in case if we foresee to use our internal customers, how we can create the situation for them to do that, and for them not to have formal approach to it, but to have really high quality assessment process. And then after the assessment, when it has been conducted, what can we do with it? Because if some work is done, its results should be integrated as well in the further process of procurement. If we don't have it, the instrument, the tool is not working as well. According to the assessment, we can define the ranking of the suppliers, which is integrated into the assessment of the supplier when we conduct the next tender procedure. When our company of Kernel has already successfully implemented the second attempt, as I said, when it happened approximately 2 years ago, or maybe a bit less, a year and a half ago. So I'd like to mention the main goals which we appointed when we implemented the assessment. First of all, we wanted to preserve the history of relations with our suppliers and what's important with our contractors, because we are dealing not only with the procurement of TMC, but also with the goods and services. Why it's important in our case? Because the enterprises of our company are all over Ukraine. It's a very big number of enterprises, and without having the common system of assessment and storage of data, some valuable experience, both positive and negative, which we gained because of the counteraction with the counteragent, we could be lost. So first of all, we needed to store them. Then we needed to find some of the weak sides for the development of the counteragent. For to take the decision and for us not to have any illusions, for us to understand that this was his strength, this was his weakness, and if this is the weakness, which is not critical for us, and we still, in spite of this weakness, go on and we are ready to work with him, then this moment should be really controlled and monitored by the customer. And if we plan cooperation further on with this counteragent, we can provide the developing feedback and to strengthen this part. For us, it was important to get additional criterion on the factual experience of the cooperation, for us to take into account the history of counteraction and collaboration with this counteragent during the tender procedure and when we select the winner. And also one more important moment, that is the objective substantiation or the argument, what I emphasize, because the assessment provides you with their substantiated argument, both for the disqualification of the unreliable suppliers, even if they provide you the minimal price, and vice versa, to really prove the assessment about the positive collaboration, which can be an additional factor which can impact that you will award a contract with this counteragent if his or her price is higher, even if it's higher, or his offer is similar to several hours, but his rank is higher considering the previous cooperation. So we can speak about a certain type of partnership. Which are the typical mistakes? According to my experience and of my colleagues who also implemented this process, first of all, the participants of the assessment don't know the aim, the goal of this event. In case if we haven't automated the assessment system, but from time to time the participants are still providing this assessment, it is important for us to have a certain communication, for us to no, I'm speaking about mistakes now, and I'm speaking how it should look like. No, so far I will speak about mistakes only. So, as for mistakes, if the participants do not know why it is done, if they don't take into account the interests of the business. Some of the criteria were invented by how important they are. As for now, it's not that obvious. If we don't have the automation of the procurement process, it is so important to implement the assessment system if the process of procurement is automated, because in the manual mode, of course, some of the tables can be compared and you can't calculate everything using the calculator, so some of the automation of the procurement process should be there. If we don't have it, it's an issue, and I would say it could really interfere into the successful implementation of the assessment. The system can be too complicated. It may not be totally integrated into the automated system of procurement. It can just exist simultaneously in some emails, notebooks, and so on, and it won't give you an opportunity to implement the successful project on assessment. The assessment can be done annually or quarterly. For instance, when we make some of the conclusions of the year, then this is the list of the counteragents, let us assess them. So the objectivity is not that much then, but still it is highly desirable. Assessing the activity, we should connect this assessment to certain deals, supplies, or works. The assessment is not compulsory. If we don't have to do it, maybe we don't do it, especially in the case if the assessment is not automated. And if the outcomes of the assessment do not impact the further work with the counteragent, then lots of work has been done. But if it doesn't impact the further process, then unfortunately, this tool won't be efficient enough and working. Which criteria of success can we see considering the experience of our implementation during the last year and a half? First of all, it's important for the initiative about the importance of the implementation of assessment would come from business, for it not to be like by the procurers, that they decided this is the best practice, so we need to implement it. But still, you don't have the communication of the interaction with the head of the department, with the initiators. In our case, there was an interesting situation when the head of one of the departments on storage, he himself provided a proposal. Let us develop the assessment tool for us to have all of our results of cooperation with the contractors stored and for us to have objective info to use it. So first of all, we had some support from the business. Well, of course, if the head of the department introduces this idea, well, of course, his subordinates will not avoid it. So I will mention the last point at this slide because it's so important as well. In our company, we have the culture which should provide continuous improvement. And this is really important. The initiatives which our employees provide, looking at the overall mood, overall culture for the changes, for the improvements, they can live well. There is no, in fact, refusal that there is some initiative we'll have to spend and to waste time on. So if this idea did not emerge among the businesses, the representatives of the manufacturing technical service, we need to try to sell this idea. For you as a procurer, you need not only to buy, but also to sell the idea. Looking at some of the examples, I'm sure that we are just repeating our own mistakes. So you should better look at the success cases. So if there was some lack of information and you could see at the iterated mistakes, it would be the argument that you need to do something. It is also for us as the expert-driven company, we also conduct international audits, both of the auditors companies and our customers. And very often one of the points of the audit is supply chain. That is the check, how we check our suppliers, how we organize the whole process. And when our managers can just show in the computer that here they have the assessment, they have the methodology, and we always get high results when we conduct the audit, it can always be motivating for the managers on procurement because they can see that this is needed, and also by our superiors, the business, which can see that we have really nice results of the audit, and this is also the investment of our procurement manager. So the next point is the business sees the advantages on the assessment. The business gets accessible, relevant, objective info. So it's not just rumors. It's not just where you need to find something in the correspondence. We can always open the card in our P2P system, the card of the counter agent, and we can see the ranking, the number of estimates, and also the criteria because of which those estimates were lower. So this is the result of the audits, and what's important, the impact of the outcomes of the assessment for the further procedures of the choice or selection. We got the result, the counter agent has his ranking, and it impacts his chances to get the next lot. Simplicity and the comprehensible character of the assessment process for all the participants to understand it. The partial or full automation. What I'd like to say about the automation, I have some cases and examples among my colleagues who have fully automated the assessment system. When is it possible? Is it possible? It's possible in the case if we take the parameters and indicators like the timeliness of delivery in the system. If we have the P2P system, they provide the planned date. The system, when the goods are coming, shows the factual date, then we compare them and they assess it. Then it could be the budget compliance, then it could be the lack or availability of some of the remarks on the quality at the in-house check. So all of that is documented in the system. The system automatically assesses each of the deals, and then they calculate automatically the ranking. If we are ready to restrict ourselves with this small but main set of criteria, then the system can be totally automated. And there are some companies in Ukraine who have totally automated it, and it is successfully working. If we would like to expand the list of criteria, for instance, we'd like to assess contractor by contractor if they are compliant to the rules on the labor market or environmental safety, or for instance the quality of the package. So if we'd like to look at the broader spectrum of criteria, in this case we need to understand that our system, whatever it is P2P or not, still will have for the initiator or the manager on procurement to be involved in this process of assessment. It is compulsory to provide assessment rather often. For instance, if it is done only for the consideration, I would say that there won't be done any assessments. So in our case, the assessment is done after each of the deals, after each of the deliveries, each of the awarding of the contract. And it is impossible to provide payment, the last payment, until you provide the full assessment. So this is how this stage cannot be skipped if it is not automated, and we don't have it automated. So in this way, we provide the full assessment of all of the deals. And what I mentioned above, it is so important for the whole company to be created to have the proper mindset for the improvement and implementation of this project. And now I'd like to show the cycle of assessment. Well, in fact, we assess the counter agent at the stage of all of the interaction. At the first stage of the contest or tender procedure or the selection process, we define the qualification, financial and technical criteria, and we can also provide the primary or repeated audit if we are working with this counter agent as the additional source of information on assessment. Then we are selecting the winner and we provide the interaction or collaboration. At this stage, we define the criteria of assessment, the key indicators of efficiency, which we can include in the contract. To make the counter agent aware of that, well, it can be done even at the stage of the tender procedure. We include that in the contract for the counter agent to understand what's for us as the customer is important. And for instance, we have some cases and tools when even the financial part is connected to those indicators. If the KPIs are efficient enough, the supplier can get additional bonuses and vice versa. We define the weight of the criteria, what's important for us. For instance, the timeliness is the most important for us. Then it could be 30 to 40%, but the style of communication, like business style, for us it's not that important, then its weight can be 5%, for instance. We define the timeliness and the periodical character of the assessment, and all of those parameters are introduced either in the contract or in our system, which assesses the interaction. Then we form the assessment. For instance, we have some of the deliveries which are done just in time, that is 2, 3, 4 times in a week, and there are some supplies which are done monthly. So we calculate the ranking, we calculate it totally automatically. Then, according to this calculated ranking, we provide the classification of the suppliers. The ranking is from 1 to 4, and then at the next slide I will show you that all of our suppliers are distributed depending on the achieved ranking. And also during the assessment process, we can separate some of the violations or miscompliances which are done by the counter agent. And again, we can provide the developing feedback, driving his or her attention to what needs adjustment. That is to provide feedback and to define the movement for the improvement. And the next stage is when how the assessment of the activity impacts the new selection. We include the ranking into the qualification criteria of the assessment when we provide the new tender procedure. In the contests and competitions, those are the procurement up to 300,000, the system is already working. The rankings are done automatically to the comparative table, which the system forms all over the offers. As for the tender procedures, we have the integration of two systems. So far, automatically the ranking is not given, but the tender manager is doing that manually, in fact. And this is the example. And at the last slide, I would like to make you acquainted with the results, the outcomes of the assessment, which we conducted during the last year. The first graph, the pie, I don't see it. Oh, now I do. So, as for now, we've provided the assessment of around 1,000 of counter-agents. Those are all of the counter-agents which we have, the active ones. So here we can see the yellow part of the pie, that is 75% of suppliers, which are totally compliant with our requirements. They have the maximum score of 4, no deviations from our assessment scale. And 25% are the counter-agents which have certain issues they need to develop. If we compare it with the contractors which execute the works, here we can see an interesting situation. If here we had 75%, which can be a very nice kind of suppliers, as for contractors, we have only 37% of them compliant to our requirements. As for all the rest, the picture is not the best. We have some room for improvement and we can do it much better. We can do lots of things better for the activity to be correspondent to our requirements. If we speak about the number of assessments, we've conducted more than 10,000 assessments of deliveries. We have 1,000 of counter-agents, but 10,000 assessments, deliveries, and each of those deliveries were assessed. So deliveries were 93% were done without any remarks. So 75% of suppliers give us 93% of supplies without any remarks, and 25% of suppliers give us remarks which are 7% only, which witnesses that we are working with the counter-agents which are really compliant and correspondent to our requirements and conditions. The main violations, of course, is the time delays, the mistakes in the documentation, the delaying of the process when we had to properly coordinate the documents. As for the work, these are the rules of the labor, and then some of the stoppages in the work because of the lack of the tool or the lack of the material, and the replacement of the staff during the work. When the contractor begins with one team, but because of some reasons during the works, they have some rotations and it leads to the delays in the process. So all of this information is stored in the card of the counter-agent, and as for any of the counter-agent, you can delve deeper into the overall ranking, and in each of the deal you can look into and you can see how the assessment was done. But if we have the minimal point, the score of 1, you should definitely attach the document which would approve that there was the very long, big delay, that there was some claim, for instance, or if there was the violation of the labor conditions, there should be the whole act special document. It is done for the assessment to be as objective as possible. It should be full of arguments, and according to each, we would be able in the future, we could assess the probability that we will definitely work with this counter-agent more and more in case if he or she takes part in our following tenders. All of that is analyzed. We look into the main spheres of work for the improvement. We include those requirements in the qualification requirements on tenders. We can add that as additional conditions for the counter-agents. And this is how this cycle becomes totally unstoppable. The choice, the selection of the counteragent, the assessment of his activity, the ranking, and considering his collaboration, we go along this spiral step by step, up and up. And I do hope that in a year, the number of counteragents with nice estimates will be not 75%, but 80, 90, and more. So this dynamics will be really reflecting that we are working and developing not only our company, but our environment, our counteragents. That's it. Thank you. If you've got any questions, please, I'm ready to answer. Victoria, there are some questions. We'll come to them later. That was very interesting and cool that you shared your examples, how you implemented the system and which issues you could face on the way of the implementation of the system. Thank you so much that you shared it. I think it is so important for our listeners to understand that it's not such a simple process, that you need to have a systematic approach and creative approach to this process and to involve business in this process, because this is a comprehensive work which should be done together, and you cannot be on your own here. You cannot do it on your own. Thank you so much. That was a very nice set of examples. I'd like to ask my colleagues, would they like to comment on something, anything? And then I will come to the questions.
So, yeah, Victoria, I just wanted, I know, Marina, you mentioned it, but I just wanted to really emphasize that point you made about the business involvement. You know, obviously in procurement, you know, we are only here to support the business goals and the business objectives, and everything that we do should be driven by that. So it's really good, I think, to see that, you know, you have really taken that on board on everything that you've done in your project, and you've worked alongside the business, because having that business support is absolutely critical to getting anything to work. So I just wanted to kind of point out that I completely agree with that. And also, you mentioned at one point selling the idea as well. And that also is very important, I think, too. So yeah, thank you for that. Really good example. Thanks very much.
Can I just add
Да,
to that?
конечно.
Can I just add to that that I wanted to thank you for your honesty. In your example, you talked a lot about continuous improvement, and you made the point, we're not there yet. And it's not easy. It's hard work. And I think in your examples you were showing we've still got some way to go. Obviously, you're very, shall we say, optimistic. But I just want to say that when people come onto these webinars, it's always good to hear, shall we say, things are not perfect, and you know, the hard work that goes into them. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
Да, я согласна.
Yes, I totally agree with that. There are not that many people who can honestly say what was working, what was not working. Peter, you wanted to add anything?
Well, just very briefly, I thought it was a very interesting talk. So thank you very much, Victoria. I agree with what Debbie and Steve have just said, of course. And I thought towards the end, Victoria, you were just saying that how this this system is in a sense a self-reinforcing dynamic as people sort of absorb the system. I think that's brilliant and that's encouraging.
Да, очень здорово.
Yes, true. That was really cool. Now let's move to the questions. But before we do that, I would like to tell you that in the Telegram channel, in Telegram, we have our channel. First of all, procurement news, Zakupivli news, where we highlight not only this event, but lots of others. And we write all of the news there, which you can read. They are written in Ukrainian, so please subscribe and you can get to know lots of new things. And at our website, my colleagues will send it in the chat now. We have the fresh article now. Thank you so much, Debbie, for your interview, where Debbie also told about the relations with the suppliers, how we can manage suppliers and how we can focus upon the support of the continuous supplies. So please don't miss that interesting article. So the questions. Victoria, what is the base which you use to create P2P system, SAP or Oracle? We have 1C, that's vision. And in fact, we have our own developers, our own DevOps, who are in the staff of the company. So if they're here, I would like to express my gratitude because their support is so important and we wouldn't deal without their help. And also I can see advantages in that because we can rapidly implement all of our business requirements and solutions. Since the moment of the business requirement formation, in a month, we implement it already. So 1C on vision, using vision. And also I would like to say a couple of words about the criteria. My colleagues asked me which criteria you're using. I would like to say that you shouldn't try to rewrite and to copy somebody's work because it is important what's important for the business. It is important what's important for your company at this moment of time. The criteria of assessment which are important for us can be totally irrelevant for you. So you should collect the focus groups, you should collect and gather the stakeholders, define them and define what's important for you. Because for some of the people, the quality of packaging, and for some people being imposing or not imposing enough. So all of that is defined considering your needs of your company. So please spend more time, conduct several focus groups, define that, and if those criteria are defined properly, this will provide some and guarantee success. Thank you. It is really so important because you shouldn't do the copy paste here. You should have a creative approach and to spend some time to that. Yes, Victoria, you were totally right. The question is in Ukrainian. Now I will try to interpret it. So, good evening. I have the question how you should properly take a decision when you select a supplier. If, for instance, the supplier with a high ranking has the higher price for the good, for instance, 5 to 7%, in comparison with the new supplier, or the supplier with the lower ranking. How do you do that? Well, maybe it's not that easy to say in the nutshell, but how did you implement that in your system? Okay, so we are now at the stage of implementation. We are providing the tender procedures in the IPS tender. The IPS tender has an opportunity to use the ranking as one of the criteria. We have some qualification in criteria with a certain weight, and each of the criteria within the qualification ones has its own weight. For instance, you can show a separate criterion, the rating or the score of the supplier, and to provide him, for instance, 20 to 30% of the weight. This is how you can calculate it and to play with it and to see what effect it will have on the overall outcome. And it turns out that each of the criteria is digitalized, it has its own weight, and then the system of APS calculates the best offer, and this best offer, considering the weight of the indicators which you defined, can be the offer of the participant with not that minimal price. For instance, the price and its weight is 60%, right? Then we have, I don't know, some technical terms of reference, compliance, it has its own weight, then the score of the counter agent with its own weight. So for this weight to really impact this overall outcome, it should be at least 15%, 10 to 15%. And then altogether, at the stage of the approval of the criteria, in the beginning of the tender procedure, you approve it with your tender commission or your procurement commission, that we distributed these criteria in this and that way with this weight and percentage. We make a deal that this percentage will be this and that, and then the system will calculate on its own. It's just important to define this weight, this percentage, and how it's important for you. whether the ranking will overweigh the difference in the price. But also we have the critical miscorrespondence. For instance, we provided this kind of a distribution. If we have the counter agent who gets 1 to 2.5, it can be the reason not to consider this offer at all, even if his price is minimal. If the ranking of the counter agent is 2.5 to 3 or to 3.5, then we look at these scales on the weight or percentage. But if the ranking is 3 to 4, this is the additional point which the counter agent gets in case if we use this scale of assessment. Thank you so much. So again, we need some creative approach to look through it, how it is working. Yes, you need to look into it and to calculate it and to provide the proper rules of the games, not to do it on your own, to write it, not to manipulate with it, but just to provide the methodology which the tender commission is taking when you provide a certain tender, because here we can look what's the most important for us. And if we have a very important project where the experience weighs a lot, where the positive collaboration weighs a lot and means a lot for us, then we can provide the higher percentage for this ranking. If we come to the contract, which has the term of 2 years, for instance, the manufacturing of some complicated equipment or some of the hard works and services, for us in this case, the experience is so important. So the percentage can be the highest for the ranking. In case of the positive experience, it can impact the selection, and vice versa, the negative experience. If it is some just one-time deal, then we see that we don't bear any risks. So we can take this ranking as an information, a piece of info, or we shouldn't take it into consideration at all, or the percentage will not be that high. Thank you so much. You already, there was the question about that. And we have the question how the criteria of assessment are connected with the risk assessment of the security service. Do you totally comply those and make those issues correspondent? Do you implement those criteria? As I said, we assess the counter agents totally according to different scales. When we select the counter agent, we assess the financial stability of the company. When we assess the balance and the documentations, there are the risk management assessment of the security service. This is a separate part of assessment, which is done systematically, and it is totally updated all the time, assessing the risks from the security service. It is done simultaneously. We have it simultaneously, and it is totally set up. It is working. So we assess our interaction. That is the experience which we got from the interaction with the counter agent, because there could be the same situation that the risks of security services are not connected with our work. There can be some, I don't know, tax debts or something like that, which do not have anything in common with our interaction. But what's important, it's always important to understand the critical misunderstandings. For instance, if there is some critical misunderstanding in the security service, we are not working with this counter agent. And if we have some of the financial outcomes with some misunderstandings, we can do again it with our system. If the counter agent got the minimal number of points, the minimal ranking, and it is totally objectified and substantiated, I should say that the minimal scores should always be approved. This is the reason not to work with this counter agent. This is just one of the assessments, financial ones, risks and security, and the assessment of the activity. All of them are interconnected. Victoria, I would like to clarify, it's important for me to understand and for our listeners as well. How then do you interconnect all of those assessments? Because you have the fourth stage, when you totally take the previous assessments for the future selection for the new tender. So you take the previous assessments, then security, then the financial one. So how do you interact them Or do you do that manually? Okay, as for IPS tender, they have the stage of data processing, when all of the offers are given, and at this stage, you totally involve the experts for the assessment of technical assessment or financial assessment. And this is the stage when we take into consideration all the info. In particular, the critical misunderstanding of the renting can be the reason for disqualification. Then, at the stage of data processing, we show the criterion. When we have this problem, it could be any of the assessments, and we just mention it, mention the responsible person for the assessment, and he shows that there is a certain discrepancy or a mismatch according to this or that indicator, and this is how disqualification can happen. As for the points, it is done by the whole system in the end of the tour. It calculates the points, and as I mentioned, it's not always happening that the minimal offer is the best. Sometimes we have the minimal offer for the price, but we have the best offer, and everything depends on the points and the percentages. And those assessments can also impact the best offer selection depending on the weight or percentage. And this is the methodology which each company can define for itself. Thank you so much. So you already advertised the APS. Well, it was the question about certain platforms. I had to advertise them. Okay, thank you. It can be done by different tools and different platforms, just for you to understand the methodological concept and to search for all of the opportunities which can help you implement it. Who is searching, this person could find. Thank you so much, Victoria. It was so interesting, and have a nice success on the future implementation and improvement of this system, on the working with all the contractors. Thank you so much. Thank you. Dear colleagues, does anybody else want to add anything about the today's topic? Because we are finally finalizing the process. No one wants to. We've got some of the words of gratitude for the today's webinar, Victoria. There are some words of gratitude for you as well. Thank you so much. I would tell that I'm really satisfied with today's webinar. I'm inspired by your speeches, Peter and Victoria. Thank you so much. Thank you that you shared your experience, invaluable expertise, and really, it is rather diverse. It allows to look at different elements and components of this mosaic of supply management and SRM systems, and to understand that this is not that easy as this may seem, that you should just select it, the tender, and then it will do on its own. We need to pay attention to that. So as it is said, then it will be working for your efforts. Maybe first it seems complicated, but then in the end of the day, you will get the outcome which you would be proud of, and you can improve your work with higher quality. Thank you all of the participants for today. I'd like to say in the end that we have one more webinar, the next one. This was the third one out of the cycle of 4 webinars. Don't miss, please. On the 17th of June, we'll have a very interesting topic, and we are preparing to eat. It's also very important: ethics in the procurement and sustainability, sustainable development of procurement and supply chain. We'll have very interesting speakers, so we're expecting for your participants and your questions, so we'll happily answer them. So we're waiting for you at our next webinar on the 17th of June at 5 p.m. by Kyiv time, or 3 p.m. by UK. So thank you so much. Have a nice evening and see you soon. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.